In this episode of the Locked On NBA Big Board Podcast, me and Leif Thulin, we are going to share our thoughts on how NIL impacted the 2025 NBA draft. We're going to discuss guys that may have been drafted in 2024, but the NIL money was probably bigger than what they would have made with the NBA contract. I mean, that is a crazy sign of the times. So once again, we're going to talk about how NIL impacts the 2025 NBA draft. Stay tuned. Big shout out to each and every person that has made the Locked On NBA Big Board Podcast your first listen of the day. I'm your host, Rafael Barlowe, the director of scouting for NBA Big Board and the founder of Big Board Global, my new, I want to say it's NBA draft related, but it's really not. It's my new college scouting service for international players. So if you're a college coach and you are looking for some international prospects for your program, go to Big Board Global Scouting. My co-host for today is none other than my guy, Leif Thulin. And before I even finish the introduction, first of all, I want to thank you, Leif, for holding it down while I was gone. I missed, I don't know, it seemed like 4 months, maybe pretty much the whole major part of the draft cycle. So thank you and my brother and Richard for holding it down while I was gone. I thought you guys did a good job. So salute to you and thank you for that. But Leif is the guy that watches more college basketball than anyone else. And so this is right up his alley, even though it is August and we still have probably 100 days? Is it a little less than 100 days until the start of college basketball?
I could skip right past college football and get straight to basketball and be thrilled. My Stanford Cardinal football team is in shambles, so I'm ready for basketball season already.
Yeah, only reason why I may have a little bit of interest in college football this year is because I bought the NCAA Football 25, got a PlayStation, and I thought I'd find some way to play it. I still haven't even completed my first season, and my brother's already on season 2, so that's probably why I may have a little bit more interest in college football. But I mean, if we skipped it, I wouldn't I wouldn't be mad at all because it's all basketball for me. But before we get too deep into this episode, I want to let you know that it is brought to you by FanDuel. You can make every moment more. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So visit fanduel.com to get started. All right, let's just get right down to business. When you first heard about NIL, did you think it would have this much of an impact on the NBA draft?
No, I thought in college basketball it would make Kentucky and Duke even further ahead of the pack. Like the blue bloods would become even richer and the separation would be wider between blue bloods and non-blue bloods. But the NBA draft has had a significant impact on college basketball, and college basketball has had a significant impact on the NBA draft, like vice versa. The reason I say that is players now who would be borderline first round picks or second round picks decide, hey, I'm going to make $2 million and it's going to be above the board and encouraged as opposed to, devious manners to get these guys paid if they were to ever come back. So it's changed the NBA draft. For instance, Coleman Hawkins got paid over $2 million by Kansas State for a 1-year deal, essentially. Like that's NBA money for a vet minimum. It's similar. It's comparable for 1 year of collegiate basketball for a player who's good, but he's not otherworldly good that would warrant $2 million. I mean, you saw it with Kansas brought in 4 wings. Bill Self said, I'm never again going to have a year where we're short of players who can do things on the perimeter, especially once Kevin McCullough got hurt. And you saw 4 of the top wings transfer to Kansas, all making north of $1 million. And not all of them would have been NBA draft picks, but I say all that to say, yes, the NBA draft would have more players that would go into it, and they would have more names that could end up on NBA rosters from the collegiate ranks if there were not such a prevalent NIL fan base, especially in the biggest and best schools of collegiate basketball history.
Is Coleman Hawkins the biggest name to you that stayed in school because of NIL?
Yeah, I think so because he's been a known commodity for so long. AJ Storr going to Kansas from Wisconsin would be one. Jeremy Roach, I don't think had much of an NBA future, but he got big time money from Baylor, leaving Duke. And then the NIL impacts the NBA draft in another way, and it's not the way that many of collegiate basketball fans would think about, but the G League the last few years was an appealing option for high schoolers with a lot of talent because they'd get paid to play basketball, and you couldn't get paid to play basketball in college up until recently. So now the G League, at least the G League Ignite, is no more. It's disbanded, and every one of those top guys is going back to college basketball. And so that's because of the NIL that the NBA draft now has players going to Rutgers. Like you have two of the top three players, presumably. I'm not saying it for everyone, but you look at most boards that Ace Bailey and Dylan Harper are in Piscataway, New Jersey, playing together, and there's NIL money that factors into that, as opposed to either of them going to the G League. I mean, college basketball is going to be awesome this year because there's going to be such top end talent in a really loaded NBA draft, so freshmen, but also there's people that stay, like Coleman Hawkins, like AJ Storr, that make some of these teams have incredible depth because some teams can afford it and some cannot.
I think the biggest name that stayed or came back to school related to NIL was Hunter Sallis. Hunter Sallis was a first round pick on my board, and I've heard that the money that he got was in a similar range to Coleman Hawkins and what's the kid's name that went to Washington? Great Osabar.
Great Osibor, yeah.
Possible. But I've also heard from different agents that some of these NIL numbers are inflated. They're kind of like European contracts in a sense, where you may sign for 1.5, 1 million, $2 million, but you may not get it. I know I personally spoke to a parent of a player that transferred. He transferred within conference last year, and he thought that he was going to a better situation, NIL, and a lot of the stuff that he was promised, it never happened. So there is a lot of that going on based off of what I'm hearing. But I do think that Salis was the guy that maybe you could throw in like Kwame Evans. I'm not sure if NIL was the impact there. Colin Murray Boyles is another name that some people believe could have gotten drafted if he stayed in the draft. I also look at a guy like oh man, I can't think of his name right now. What's the kid from Syracuse that I imagine he lost
Oh,
a lot of money?
I know
Man.
who you're talking about too. Freeman, Donnie Freeman.
No. The kid from last year that
Oh, Judah Mintz.
Judah Mintz. I imagine Judah Mintz could have commanded 1.5 million, maybe $2 million in the open NIL market. He chose to go professional, and I think he lost a lot of money in that sense. So when you look at this whole NIL landscape, and you mentioned that college basketball is going to be stronger this year, how much of it do you think is the freshman class or the guys returning because of NIL money?
I'd say it's a mix. I think the excitement will be ratcheted up because of the freshman class, because of Cooper Flagg, because of Ace Bailey, Dylan Harper. You haven't had that much excitement since Zion Williamson in collegiate basketball, especially in regards to the NBA draft. The last few years, it's been okay. Well, Wembanyama's taking the headline, Scoot Henderson, and yeah, Brandon Miller was awesome, but he was older, and you and I were among the highest people on him entering the year. He was considered 15th best freshman. He ended up being the best. But you look at it this year, there's blockbuster names in the freshman class, and that brings the excitement. In terms of the deep, nerdy college basketball fans, I think I'm excited because there's players that have transition spots, but teams are really deep this year, and it's not just one or two teams that are deep that thrive from the NIL market. You see teams like Alabama, who doesn't have the greatest basketball history, makes a Final Four run, retains two of their big players, has a guy that you and I are both very high on in Jaren Stevenson, brings in a few transfers, and has another Final Four caliber roster. And that's not like the presumptive favorite in the SEC either. There's still Kentucky that has all the moving pieces of losing Calipari. Calipari goes to Arkansas. Kansas reloads. North Carolina was the number one seed, and they're back with all those guys. And it, to me, what makes it so great is the teams that you expect to be good in any given college basketball year should be awesome. And there's a lot of newer teams that retain talent and bring in talent via the freshman or the transfer portal. So I think there's 10 teams that can win it all. And if you asked me last year how many teams there could be that would win it all, I'd have given you two, and it would have been UConn and Purdue from the very start of the season. And then I would have tossed Tennessee in there as a third. But it was a foregone conclusion within a week of last season. This year, it's going to be wide open. There's going to be a ton of excitement all over the board.
All right, when we return, I want to talk about a few of the guys that you were actually surprised they came back to school, and if you think NIL was a factor or was it more related to improving their draft stock. But before we get started on that, I want to let you know that this episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. Give online therapy a try at betterhelp.com/lockedonnba and get on your way to being your best self. Because I have some questions like, what are your self-care non-negotiables? Maybe you never skip leg day or therapy. When your schedule is packed with kids and activities and big work activities and more, it is very easy to let your priorities slip. And even when we know what makes us happy, it is hard to make time for it. I can totally relate to that based off everything that I've been going through. One of my favorite things to do is ride a bike. During COVID, I was riding a bike about 20 miles per day. I went to Chicago last week and I was able to ride up Lakeshore Drive. But I like riding bikes, but I just have not had the time. And if you are like me and you don't have time for yourself, some of the non-negotiables like therapy are more important than ever. So if you are thinking about starting therapy, you got to give BetterHelp a try. It is entirely online. It is designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. All you have to do is just fill out a questionnaire, get matched up with a licensed therapist. You can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. So never skip therapy day when you have BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedonnba today. You can get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp.com/lockedonnba. So once again, thank you for making the Locked On NBA Big Board podcast your first listen of the day. Now for your second listen, you got to check out the Locked On NBA podcast, because with Locked On, there is no off season, and Locked On NBA provides daily analysis from local and national experts, and you get it all in 30 minutes or less. No one keeps you as formed and as entertained as Locked On NBA, which is available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. And Locked On NBA is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, second segment, we're going to talk about some of the guys that chose to return to school, who I think may have had a strong chance of being drafted. I mentioned Hunter Sallis as a guy that I had a first-round grade for. I thought he would have been a first-round pick, but you never know. The draft is tricky. I mean, nobody expected A.J. Johnson to go where he went in the draft. So there's always going to be some surprises on draft day. But I gave Hunter, or had him as a first-round grade. Is there anybody that you had as a first-round grade that chose to return to school? And if so, do you think it was more related to impact, or I'm sorry, the impact of NIL, or do you think it was related to feeling like they can improve their draft stock?
I didn't have anyone in the first round grade. Hunter was my highest returner. And then I had three that were kind of early second rounders. I had Cam Jones, who I kind of knew was coming back to Marquette, but I ranked him up until they took his name out. Alex Caravan from UConn, who I had about number 40. I want to say 38. He's someone that I think came back because he wants to chase history just as much as NIL factored in. He could be one of the first and only players ever to three-peat as a champion with a really good UConn team. I liked him, but I think NIL factored into that equation, but I don't think as enormously. And then, of course, Coleman Hawkins, where NIL absolutely factored into the equation. And then you could look at a few other guys like Caleb Love. I didn't have him ranked very highly, but he's a guy where he's going to make just as much money, if not more, at Arizona, have a chance to star in a talented team. So there's plenty of those type of guys, but those are the ones that come to my mind.
All right, so you're in Utah. What about Jackson Robinson? Do you think that was NIL or draft stock?
I'd say a combination of both. I don't think he had a particularly great combine from what I viewed. And then you get an opportunity to go to the SEC and go to Big Blue Nation in Kentucky and play in front of scouts. And you saw what Antonio Reeves was able to do the year before in his fifth year. Why not demonstrate that there? So I think a combination. I think he obviously made more money doing that, but also I don't think his stock was climbing that high. And I think he believes this year he'd have a better chance to showcase what he can do than he was able to do at BYU.
There's one name that comes to mind, and I could be totally wrong here. I apologize if I'm wrong, but I imagine that his decision to transfer may have been NIL related because just on the outside looking in, it doesn't make sense. And that's Aiden Holloway. He
Yep.
played a lot at Auburn. He transfers within like not only within the state to like hated rivals. I think it should be illegal for people to transfer from Auburn to Alabama, Michigan, Ohio State, North Carolina, the Duke. I mean, I just think like it is weird. Like that's just my personal opinion. Even though with the with all these conference realignments, I think some of these rivalries aren't the same anymore. But Holloway doesn't look like there's a clear path for him to be the starter at Alabama. Maybe he was banking on Mark Sears not coming back, and you can make a case and say Mark Sears returning to school was NIL related because you can imagine he may be at least making the same amount, if not more, by returning to Alabama. But on the outside looking in, and I could be totally wrong, it looks like Aiden Holloway made a mistake by transferring.
Yeah, I think he must have thought that even if Sears were to come back, he would play in a two-guard lineup because they played two smaller guards last year and with Aaron Estrada. And so maybe that was beneficial to him. However, Alabama has resources upon resources, brought in young blood from USF on a team that was a shocking one seed in conference play that no one saw coming. And he was the guy who propelled them. And then they also retain Latrell Wrightsell, have Jaron Stevenson and Grant Nelson, who are both very versatile and can play numerous positions, which further hurts Holloway's chances of playing because if they take up more than just the big positions, there's fewer guard minutes. And Sears obviously factors to be I'd say he's probably a first team All-American preseason at least. So
Yeah.
Holloway probably would have been a 15 point per game guy at Auburn. And now I don't think he scores that much at Alabama, despite their up-paced tempo and numerous guards and lots of threes getting up. It's attractive system if you're an undersized guard. However, you got to play to give yourself a chance, and I don't think he plays enough.
Yeah, I mean that's what I'm thinking. Like it's an attractive system to play in. He started 26 games last year and played 20 minutes per game. Now the numbers were pretty brutal. 31.8% from the floor, 30% from three. He averaged 7 points a game. But I personally feel like if he stays at Auburn, he is one of the guys that I would have been talking about as a breakout player in his second year. Now I just think there's an uphill battle for him to climb. You mentioned Caleb Love earlier. I don't know what he can do on the college level again to prove his NBA draft stock. I thought he kind of improved across the board at Arizona. If I remember correctly, he had it was like a bad end to the season. He may have had like one of his off nights that he's pretty much prone to.
Yeah,
And
they
for
were bad
him,
against Clemson. I don't know exactly the numbers, but he and the rest of the Arizona team was pretty terrible against Clemson. Clemson thoroughly beat them.
yep, yep. And so I think for him, it makes sense. NIL is good for guys like him, someone that is going to, he's going to help your team win. You know that he's going to be a big star in the college level. May not have the most love from NBA scouts. I think NIL is really big for him, and I think that it was a wise decision to come back to school, put a little bit more money in his account. From everything that I've heard, and I could be totally wrong again, but I imagine he's getting, a million or in somewhere in that range. And if this is his third year in that range, he's made as much money as some guys that were first round picks in the 2021 or 22 NBA draft. So I think it was wise for him to come back. You mentioned Dickinson. Is there any other guys that you feel like are borderline draftable that you think should just continue to ride the NIL wave, especially if they still have a COVID year? Any guys come to mind?
Well, yeah, the last one would have been Sears and RJ Davis, two diminutive guards that play better in the college basketball style than the NBA, both of whom are back, both of whom were All-Americans, both of whom project to be All-Americans once more. I think those are the two that smartly rode the wave, tested, hey, how much how much appeal do I have with different NBA teams? Davis has one more year than Sears. Sears is on his final year. He came back, goes back to a team that figures they can contend for a championship. Same with RJ Davis. And I'd imagine RJ Davis, even though he would have one more year, I believe, will not come back for one more year unless the play of Drake Powell or Jackson just doesn't show up and they come back for one more year. But I think he's going to be riding out on a high wave. Elliot Cadeau probably stays. There's a lot of guards in Chapel Hill, and I think this is his last hurrah.
Ryan Kalkbrenner is a name that I think should be mentioned in that list. I don't think it would be unheard of if he were a second round pick, but I think it kind of probably made more sense for him with a little bit, probably a better financial situation guaranteed if he were to return to Creighton. All right. Well, when we return, we're going to play a little game here where I'm going to name a prospect, and I want you to share your thoughts on the reason he returned. Was it NIL? Was it to improve his draft stock? Or do you think it was a combination of both? But before we get into that game, let's talk about FanDuel because I love sports and I love them so much. I never want them to stop. But as we get into the middle of the summer, we get fewer games and the sports aren't sporting like I want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head to FanDuel.com and start making the most of your summer. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, last segment. I'm going to name some names. And I just want you to say the reason why this player returned, in your opinion, NIL to improve his draft stock, or do you think it was a little bit of both? All right, let's start with a name we mentioned earlier, Colin Murray Boyles.
I would say probably NIL factors in a little bit, but I'd say mostly to improve his draft stock because I don't think he was a good enough shooter for people to really have him as highly as some did. So I'd go mostly to improve his draft stock. I'm sure he got a boost in pay, leveraging the interest, some interest he did have.
DJ Wagner.
I mean, he's getting paid regardless, but I'd say it has to be for his draft stock because I don't think his draft stock was existent.
Trevon Brazile.
Draft stock because his knee's not right. He doesn't look like the athlete he once was. So he might as well get paid along the way, but he wasn't getting drafted, I don't think, this past year.
Peyton Sanford.
Now, that's an interesting one because he played terribly at the combine, but I would have ranked him as a top 3 shooter coming in. So I'll say NIL because Iowa lost a ton. And he stayed at Iowa rather than transferring elsewhere, which I think would have more directly helped his draft stock. So I'll say NIL. I don't know for certain how much they're paying him, but I imagine after having NBA prospects the last few years in the Murrays and Garza, that now you have one guy that still can get you buckets. Let's go out and pay him a little bit. I think that one's NIL.
Iowa every year it's like they find a guy, like they just kind of anoint him. You're the guy, and then his draft stock kind of soars. Let's go with Tyrese Proctor.
I'm going to go draft stock, and the rationale is he could have left the year before that and been taken in the first round if a team liked him, even though he shot poorly, because he's a 6'5" defensive ace who's very good in pick and roll, and he demonstrated that with Lively. Just Lively wasn't healthy early in the season. I think he had a subpar year last year trying to figure out what position he was playing next to a diminutive guard in McCain and a ball in hand guy like Roach. I think this year is more of a clarification. I'm the point guard and defensive ace. Yes, Duke's going to have plenty of money, but he could have gone elsewhere and gotten more.
Zvonimir Ivisic. I would have taken him in the first round.
That one's really hard because you don't know what he's gotten and you don't know how much playing time he's going to get because they also brought in Jonas Adu, who's a better player in the same league already, and they have all these other transfers. So I would be inclined to say money, but his stock has to improve because he played sparingly due to NCAA limitations. and in my opinion, poor estimations on the NCAA's part. But I'd say half and half on that one.
That's interesting to me because it seems like he put himself right back in the same situation that he was in
Yeah.
at Kentucky. And then it makes me wonder, like, was it NIL? And I think that there's a lot of players that it's short-term money, but it kind of impacts their long-term goals. And I did a camp in the spring, and it was basically like a camp of guys that best case scenario we're going to get two ways, but more than likely undrafted. Well, I shouldn't say more than likely. All of them were going to go undrafted. Best case scenario was a two-way, but more realistic best case scenario would have been an Exhibit 10. And so while I was doing the research and coming up with a list of players, there were so many guys that it was hard to justify inviting them to this camp because they had really good numbers at one school and then they transferred for NIL reasons and then they barely played. And so I think that that's going to unfortunately be a common theme where the opportunity to play, like, to go from like a mid-major to a Power Five school, I think that's going to be enticing, especially if you're at a mid-major school that doesn't have big NIL money, and then you can make whether it's $200,000 or $300,000 to transferring up at a Power Five school, but that doesn't mean you're going to get the same opportunity. And so I think for some guys that taking the short-term money has an impact on just their career long term because they may be entering their last year of college basketball without strong numbers. All right, let's go back to the game. Wooga Poplar. I liked him at one point. I thought he was a top 30 guy. Then he just really really cooled off, and then I can't recall seeing a guy who has a strong draft buzz and then like literally just falls off the cliff in the middle of the season. What do you think played a role in him coming back to school and transferring to Villanova?
Well, because he went to Nova, I'm gonna say it's money, and I know he's from Philly, so don't like I people are gonna say, "Oh, you're ignorant. He's going back home." That all is true, but Nova has emptied their pockets the last few years. They're desperate for a good year. They have a ton of financial resources invested in basketball, and Wooga Poplar had a great start. In fact, I think it was January 1st or 2nd. I did a podcast. I said I guarantee Baylor Showerman's gonna be a first pick. I guarantee Jalen Tyson's gonna be a first round pick. And Wooga Poplar was the one I said I'm less on the table for him, but he was the last wing. I said no one's talking about these three, but these three are going to be first rounders. So I went 2 for 3, but the guarantees hit barely. Showerman got the 30th pick, so thank you. But long story short, I was on the Wooga train as well. He fell off the cliff. He's talented. He's going to be good at Nova, but that's an NIL play for me.
All right, this one should be pretty easy. Baba Miller.
That one was so strange though, going to FAU after Dusty May left. Like I think he's trying to improve his draft stock because it fell off a cliff. But you can't say, oh, he went to the team that just lost in the champion or the Final Four. Now they lost in the first round and they lost their coach. So that one's improving stock to me, even if they did pay as much as they could to get him.
What about Broom from Auburn?
I think that's NIL. I don't think he's an NBA player. He's slow twitch to me, and he's productive, but he's in his 6th year, so I think he's riding out the NIL wave. And I don't know. I've been critical of him on college basketball, and people get mad at me, but every time I watch him, I think the same thing.
All right, last one. Here's a guy that I had heard that one team had him in their top 40, and I do think that he probably would have looked good in that combine setting. JT Toppin.
I think he's improving his stock, but clearly going to a place other than New Mexico, getting Power Five money is huge for him. So I think that one's a true combination. He did impress in that setting, but he's got to prove that he can play against the big boys more regularly in the Big 12, as opposed to playing well in 1 or 2 games at New Mexico and generating stock. And also has to prove his shot's legitimate. So I'd say that's proving the stock, but certainly Big 12 money is better than what you can get at New Mexico, even though they do have a nice basketball history.
Yeah, but Texas Tech has long money. They have a lot of money out there. Well, that wraps up this episode of the Locked On NBA Big Board Podcast. That was fun. Leif didn't know that I was going to put him on the hot seat and ask him whether guys were coming back because of NIL or draft stock. So thank you for playing along with the game. But thank you again for making the Locked On NBA Big Board podcast your first listen of the day. Now, once again, you got to check out the Locked On NBA podcast where the season never ends. And they have national and local experts that give you just a great perspective. So you can find the link to the Locked On NBA in the description, so you do not need to search. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Once again, I'm Rafael Barlowe with Leif, Thulin, and we are out of here.